Hello! The purpose of this video is to introduce some physical concepts and terminology used in cardiovascular physiology and medicine.
Here are the four concepts we will focus on here. These are not biological or medical terms, but physical concepts. A lot of students are less comfortable with physical concepts than with other domains, yet there are unavoidably a few basic concepts from physics that are fundamentally important to understanding basic physiology. All of these four concepts come up repeatedly in medicine and physiology. These four concepts are particularly important in cardiovascular physiology and medicine. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me and trust me that spending a few minutes going over some basic physics will pay off down the line. That is, because if you have a working understanding of what these terms mean in a physical sense, then things will make more sense later on when these concepts come up in different contexts. First concept, pressure. Here are two equivalent and both useful ways to think about pressure. The first definition that comes to mind might be this one: the perpendicular force per unit area applied to an enclosing surface. Think about a balloon. The pressure difference between the inside and outside is a measurement of the force per unit area the gas inside the balloon is applying to the wall of the balloon. The pressure is equivalently the mechanical potential energy, that is the potential to do work, stored per unit volume in a material. Unit-wise, these are the same things: force per unit area and energy per unit volume. Now, it makes sense to think about pressure as mechanical potential energy density. If you blow up a balloon, you're storing energy in the system, energy that has the potential to be used to do work. For example, if you release the opening on the balloon, it will fly around. The energy stored in the pressure is being converted to make the balloon fly around. Similarly, when the heart contracts, the pressure in its chambers increases. That mechanical energy is used to propel the blood through the body. To give you an intuitive idea of what is blood pressure, consider this monumental experiment conducted several hundred years ago by Stephen Hales. So this is an illustration of the first ever measurement of arterial blood pressure. That's kind of a big deal. You know that you can't walk into a doctor's office without getting your blood pressure measured. And luckily, we don't have to do it this way. Now, what Hales and his assistant did is they cannulated a carotid artery of a supine horse and measured the height of a column of blood in a glass tube connected to the large artery. The gravitational force of the fluid pressing down on the column is balancing the pressure of blood in the vessel. The higher the column of blood, the higher the pressure. And that's why this is a measure of blood pressure. So what is the systolic blood pressure in this animal? So if the column of blood is 2.4 meters, and since the blood has roughly the density of water, we can report that the systolic blood pressure is around 240 centimeters of water. Mercury is about 13 times more dense than water, so you can convert these units from centimeters of water to millimeters of mercury by dividing 240 centimeters by a factor of 13 millimeters of mercury per centimeter of water. You get 180 millimeters of mercury as a result. So compare that to the normal human systolic blood pressure of around 120 millimeters of mercury. So one of the values of this illustration is that it gives you a feeling for the pressure driving force of the arterial blood. That's a couple of meters of water or blood. Another way to think about it is to imagine diving underwater. So if you dive underwater 2 meters, and that's about 6.5 feet, then the pressure that you feel is roughly equivalent to the pressure generated by the left ventricle. Going into a little bit more detail, when we use the term blood pressure, without getting more specific, we're talking about the pressure in the blood in the lumens of the large systemic arteries. The peak aortic blood pressure in systole, that's when the left ventricle is contracting, is around 120 millimeters of mercury. The minimum pressure in diastole, that's the relaxation phase, is around 80 millimeters of mercury. Now, for more information on the cardiac cycle and diastole and systole, related concepts, see the video about the cardiac cycle. Now keep in mind, the numbers on this slide are not absolute fixed numbers. They vary a lot among individuals, time of day, etc., and they vary a lot in disease. But they're reasonable numbers to have in your mind as normal baseline values. So the blood returning to the right side of the heart, for example, in the great veins is around 4 or 5 millimeters of mercury. The pulmonary arterial pressures, the pressures generated by the pumping of the right ventricle, are, at least normally, much lower than the systemic arterial pressures. Here we're looking at that same information in a more schematic way. Blood is pumped out of the left side of the heart to the body with an arterial driving pressure of 120 millimeters of mercury systolic, 80 millimeters of mercury diastolic. It's pumped out of the right side with a pressure of around 25 millimeters of mercury systolic. Blood returns to the left and the right side with pressures of a few millimeters of mercury. Recapping our definitions of pressure, pressure is the force per unit area in the lumen of a vessel or of chamber of the heart, or it is the mechanical energy density per unit volume. Those definitions are equivalent. The force exerted on the blood that is associated with the difference in pressure is the driving force for the circulation. Okay, so that's at least ignoring gravity. Blood is always going to be propelled from the higher to the lower pressures. For now, don't worry about gravity. Later on in these lectures, we'll talk about how the effects of gravity are accounted for. Next concept, flow. Flow is a rate of fluid movement or fluid transport per unit time. For example, a very important flow is the cardiac output. That's the flow of blood out of the heart averaged over the cardiac cycle. We can do some simple, fun calculations to give you an intuitive feeling for the magnitude of the cardiac output. Every time the heart beats, a certain amount of blood is ejected from each ventricle. This is called the stroke volume. So let's say the left ventricle ejects 70 milliliters of blood per beat. And if the heart is beating 70 times per minute, and we can take 70 milliliters per beat times 70 beats per minute, and we get 4,900 milliliters, or about 5 liters per minute. That's the cardiac output. Now, let's say your body contains 5 liters of circulating blood. If your cardiac output is 5 liters per minute, that means the heart pumps the entire content of the body's blood once per minute. That also means that it takes, on average, 1 minute for a red blood cell to travel a complete circuit. So that is the time it takes to transit from the left ventricle out through the aorta to some vascular bed, to return to the right side, travel through the lung, and then return to the left ventricle. All right, so that means circulatory time, about 1 minute approximately. That represents an average because there are fast paths through the systemic circulation, say through the kidney, which has a very high flow, and slower paths, say through a resting muscle or through bone. Now, how much time does it take a particle of blood? How much time does a particle of blood spend in passing through the lung? Well, roughly speaking, the lung contains about 1/10 of the blood, so the passage time through the blood is about 1/10 of the total passage time, let's say about 6 seconds. And it's not an arbitrary coincidence that the transit time in the lung is roughly 6 seconds, because that's roughly the respiration rate. Okay, so I think the concepts of pressure and flow are pretty straightforward. The other two concepts we want to go over sometimes give a bit more trouble. And it makes sense to talk about work and power together. So without further ado, concepts 3 and 4, work and power. So these are fundamentally mathematical concepts. So words definitions are difficult to make perfect, but here's a pretty good definition that I found at the Encyclopedia Britannica site. Work is the energy transfer that occurs when an object or a fluid is moved over a distance by an external force. So by the way, we're talking about mechanical working power here. Cardiac work, cardiac mechanical work, is the amount of mechanical work done by the heart over some specified period of time in pumping the blood. So we can think of it as how much mechanical energy is transferred to the blood from the heart in pumping it. Power is closely related to work. It's the rate of doing work. And that's the fundamental difference and also the fundamental connection between work and power. Work has units of energy, like joules or calories. Power has units of energy per unit time, like joules per second, which is the same as watts. So to understand work and power, all we have to do is combine our definitions of pressure and flow. Let's say, as an example, the left ventricle is ejecting blood at an average of 100 millimeters of mercury more pressure than the entering blood. So remember, we can think of pressure as an energy density. That means that the mechanical energy density of the output blood is 100 millimeters of mercury higher than the input blood. Okay, so the mechanical energy density of the blood is increased by 100 millimeters of mercury. How quickly is the heart doing that? The heart is pumping a certain amount of blood per unit time. That's the cardiac output. So the power generated by the left ventricle in pumping the blood is equal to the mean pressure difference times the flow, or the cardiac output. Pressure, remember, units of energy per unit volume, times flow, units of volume per unit time, gives units of energy per unit time, which is units of power. So now if you do that calculation using these numbers, using these units, these physiological units, you get a number 500 millimeters of mercury per minute, which is kind of a nonsense number because it doesn't have much meaning in those units. But if you convert that number to more familiar units, you wind up with about 1 1/2 thousandths of a horsepower, or about 1 watt. So remember, a horsepower is roughly the amount of mechanical work that a horse does per unit time. If you drive a car, your car probably has 100 or more horsepower. Its engine can generate 100 or more horsepower. The heart generates about 1/1000th of horsepower. Another reference point, the adult human body consumes food energy at a rate of about 100 watts. Okay, so you're burning calories at about 100 watts throughout the day. The left ventricle under resting conditions does about 1 watt of work. So that means about 1% of the calories that you ingest are converted to mechanical work by your heart, which is something that's, I think, is kind of cool to know. So why do we care about all of that? It sounds like a bunch of physics, not physiology. Well, the human body does obey the laws of physics after all, and sometimes physical concepts are important. For example, it turns out that the maximal mechanical cardiac power output of the heart is the strongest predictor of mortality and heart failure. Moreover, myocardial oxygen demand, which is proportional to coronary flow demand, is determined by cardiac power. Now, it's hard to directly estimate cardiac power because it requires measuring stroke volume or cardiac output. So it's hard to estimate based on things you can measure non-invasively, but there is a handy index of relative change in cardiac power output called the rate pressure product. The rate pressure product is the heart rate times the systolic blood pressure. Cardiac output goes up and down roughly in proportion to heart rate, and thus the rate pressure product is roughly proportional to cardiac power. And that means that a change in rate pressure product gives you an index of a change in myocardial oxygen demand. Now, just again, there's going to be more about coronary blood flow and myocardial oxygen demand in other lectures, but myocardial oxygen demand is how much oxygen the heart requires for energy metabolism. For the sake of this video, what I want is you to take away a working appreciation and understanding for these 4 physical concepts. Thank you for listening.